very happy to invite Guillaume from the Libre, Université Libre de Bruxelles, who will talk about the Cosmo-logic of Qur'anic demonology. Please, Guillaume.
So, the title of my paper is, of course, an allusion to Bruce Lincoln's famous paper, The Cosmo-logic of Persian Demonology. And I guess all of you, or almost all of you, know this paper, published a few years ago in his book, Gods and Demons, Priests and Scholars, since this is probably the most Zoroastrian-friendly congress I ever was. So there is no need to insist here on the importance of demonology and its role in naming, comprehending, and defending against all that threatens, frightens, and harms us. This is a point rightly stressed by Lincoln himself. In late antiquity, and before and after as well, everyone believed in demons, or better, in spirits, and the control of, and maybe more, the protection from such beings was probably for most of the people the main affair in life. At least protection from malevolent beings, especially in some very specific context, like when we know there were demons everywhere, but especially demons might be especially active and dangerous when people had to wander in liminal places, or when they had to eat or practice sexual intercourse or any kind of behavior which involved corporeal functions or vital functions. For example, just to give a brief digression, even today in the Berber part of Algeria, women, who are Muslims, when they change, for example, the diapers of their children, of the babies, make the sign of the cross. Why? Because, not all, but most of them, even when Muslims, because the sign of the cross is supposed to be a way to put away demons. And changing the diapers is a very specific and liminal action, which might be the good opportunity for demons to enter the body of a child. So we have to put away demons this way. Just to show also that these questions of the techniques of fighting demons might be transconfessional. In fact, demonology brings us as close as possible, of course, to folk religion, popular religion, but not only because we know it concerned also literati, but it brings us very close to the daily religious practices and the common worldviews and representations of such ancient communities. But we should be aware also that there is always a possible gap between these daily lived practices and the widespread worldviews they imply, and what we find written in text. So my goal today is to give a brief overview of Quranic demonology. I will try to highlight what is there, in the Qur'an, but also what is not there, because it can be also significant. And maybe if I have time, it could be a good evidence for giving some clues about the possible genesis or prehistory of the Qur'an itself. So let us look at the demonology as we can sketch it from the Qur'an. There are, in fact, three kinds of figures of evil in the Qur'an. I leave aside Harut and Marut. First, Iblis or Shaitan, the same character with two different names. We'll see why later. Second, the demons, the Shayateen. And third, the jinns. So, as I told, I think there are good reasons to see Iblis and Shaitan as one and the same being. Demons and jinns, in a way, are the same beings, and in another way, they are not, which is a bit strange, but I will try to explain how this is possible. And the last point, which in part answers the previous question, jinns are much more ambivalent than demons, since there are jinns who are believers, and jinns, most of them, who are not believers. So let us begin with Iblis and Shaitan. Well, the name Iblis, except for one occurrence, always appear in connection with a very specific story, and only one, namely the prostration of the angels. The only other example is in Surah 26, with the formula Junud Iblis, the soldiers of Iblis. It's quite hard to know why Iblis is used there. Maybe it could be a reference to the idea that Iblis has descendants idea which is expressed in Surah 18, but except Junud Iblis, the proper name Iblis, appears only with one narrative, the prostration of the angels. There are good reasons to propose the following chronology. I will not prove it here, but I have two caveats before going further. First of all, I personally completely dismiss the Meccan-Medinan divide. So my chronology has nothing to do with Meccan surahs or Medinan surahs, since I'm pretty sure that there are texts which are pro-Islamic and others which are posterior to the conquest. So anyway, let's skip it. And second, it's not because, for example, the text in Surah 2, the pericope in Surah 2 is later, for example, than the text in Surah 7, that Surah 7 as a whole is earlier than Surah 2 as a whole. I mean, these are two different questions, so let's be cautious about this. Anyway, the story in question is well known. God orders the angels to prostrate before Adam. But one of the angels, Iblis, refuses because, he says, he was made of fire and not of clay like Adam. So, says Iblis, I was made of from higher stuff than Adam, so I am higher than Adam, so I don't have to prostrate before Adam. That's the idea. Here is one of the versions of this story. This story, as we know it, has Christian origins. You can find it in the Cave of Treasures, in some versions of the life of Adam and Eve, in the questions of Bartholomew, in the Apocalypse of Shadrach, and so on. There is, of course, a similar story in Jewish sources about the prostration of the angels, but the end, as far as I know, is a bit different, since in this case, gods make Adam fall asleep, so the angels realize Adam is not God, and therefore they do not prostrate. So we have one story, written several times, or alluded to several times, and slightly modified. For example, the mention of God insufflating his spirit in Adam appears only in Surah 38 and 15. A story of Christian origins, which is progressively, I might say, de-Christianized. First point, which is important, I think, is that, except in Surah 2, I will go back to this very, very soon, we are never told in the Qur'an why the angels have to prostrate before Adam. In the Christian stories, it's absolutely clear. The angels have to prostrate because Adam was created at God's image. And of course, Adam appears as an antitype of Jesus. So, in the Quran, we have no clue about it, even if, given the very elusiveness of the story, maybe the reason why it is not told is that it is well known by the possible audience, or supposed to be known. But anyway, the basic plot presupposes that Adam is created at God's image. I know in Islamic theology this idea is given up, but the Quran is much more ambiguous about this topic. In Surah 2, however, it's something a bit different. Then we have an explanation of why maybe the angels have to prostrate, and maybe it's not a coincidence if the pericope in Surah 2 is the latest one. In Surah 2, before the verse referring to the prostration of the angels, we are told that God taught Adam the names of things and animals, so the reverse than the Bible where Adam tells himself the names, and then the angels are asked to give the names of the animals or things, and they can't, but Adam can. So it's supposed, I think, to explain why or in what way Adam could be superior to the angels. Well, it goes, of course, without saying that Iblis is an angel, otherwise the story would be meaningless. However, it is told once in Surah 18 that Iblis is a jinn, or Jan. So, but I won't discuss this complex point here. Well, Iblis and Shaitan are certainly the same character. Iblis while he is still in paradise, and Shaitan after his fall. If you look at the stories in Surah 7, 17 and 20, you see clearly that we have the story which goes on. What is at stake here are the origins of evil. Once Iblis is cursed, and that the decision of his banishment is taken, he negotiates with God the possibility of becoming a tempter for humans. Well, in most Christian versions, the banishment of the devil, of Satan, explains why the devil is angry against Adam, because since Adam deprived him of his high position, he becomes angry against Adam, so he hates the human race. Here in the Qur'an, we have a negotiation between Iblis and God about letting Iblis, or Shaitan later, the opportunity to tempt, to betray man until the end of times. So a bit later in the same passage, then we have a new story, namely the fall of Adam, because the devil tempted him, and here we have the word Shaitan, the devil, which is clearly the same, I think, character with another name. So let's look at the general Quranic image of the devil as Shaitan. So the devil, in line with his deleterious behavior in the fall of Adam, he caused Adam and his wife to slip from heaven, is the clear enemy, the manifest foe of man. He is a tempter, someone who leads astray, making bad things for humans enticing in their eyes. He is a rebellious being, and so on. And there is also a reminder which is often repeated in the Qur'an, I mean a moral reminder which comes quite often in the Qur'an: do not follow the steps of Satan. Do not be friends or followers of Satan and his comrades. And of course, seek refuge and protection from Satan in God only. Well, there is nothing surprising here. This is the standard Christian, I might say, image of the devil. The Satan we know as a common name in the Old Testament is the opponent of God and of all of those who believe in God. In the New Testament, he is the tempter par excellence, the instigator of evil deed and also evil knowledge. That's a very important point. I mean, the devil, and later we'll see the demons themselves in the Qur'an, like in Christian demonology, are the instigators of evil deed and also of evil knowledge. The idea of demons or fallen angels, for example, as instigators of evil practices, of evil knowledge or evil science, is, for example, present in the Book of Jubilees and other kinds of texts. The same idea is also present in Christian texts, and in particular in Christian heresiological discourse. There is the idea that the devil or the demons are those who teach heresies to the founders of heresies. About the name Shaitan, now, there is an Arabic root, shatana, which means fetching water from a well by means of a bucket and a rope, and there is an Arabic word, shaitan, which means rope and metaphorically snake. But this shaitan has etymologically nothing to do with the shaitan we are examining here. But note, by the way, that there is a nice ambiguity, because in this verse, for example, of course people understand the devil, Satan, as a shaitan, but you can understand, given the other Arabic word shaitan, the serpent, the snake, which is precisely the animal which is tempting Adam and his wife in Genesis. So there are good reasons to believe that the word shaitan for devil comes from Ethiopia, especially from Gez, Satan, devil, demon, adversary, in the plural Sayatan, Sayatanet. Note that in Gez and Arabic as well, this is a common name, not a proper name. And not also the Gez word regum, cursed, for example, in Saytana regimu, by cursing Satan in Gez. And I think the context and these etymological points, I think, show that a Shaitana regime should not be understood as Satan the stoned in the Qur'an, but as Satan the cursed. I think it's a much more convincing translation. So, but we are here very close, once again, to standard. Christian demonology is, of course, a very significant thing. But besides as shaitan, we have the demon, shaitan, every demon, or the demons in the plural, shayatin, in the Qur'an. This is the same word, except that it is used in the plural, for example. So, what does the Qur'an tell us about the demons or the devils? First point, demons never appear as good in the Qur'an. I'm not so sure they sometimes appear as good in Christian discourse, but that's another point. But in the Qur'an, never as good. So there are no good demons in the Qur'an. the demons are not named. We have no name for demons, no description for demons, and so on. We have only, a few caveats about demons. So first, the unbelievers have a close relationship with demons, as shown on in these excerpts. And of course, both unbelieving believers and the demons will finish together in hell. Second, the demons, like Satan, lure, deceive the believers. And you can see also in Surah 6, verse 71, that the prayer is seen as a way to be guided to God, or to become close to God and to put the demons away. So that's an important point also. In fact, the demons are playing roughly the same role as the devil or the demon himself. They are just little demons, if you want. There is also another passage which is a bit strange, because here we are close to the idea that the demons can enter the body while eating illicit food. It's not explicit, but we have an order, do not eat illicit food, and just after, a reference to the demons. Well, it reminds, of course, about, for example, the idea explicit, just to give an example, in the Pseudo-Clementine homilies literature, that eating illicit food is dangerous because demons enter the body while you are eating illicit food. Maybe it is present here too. There is also the story of Solomon and the demons. Well, we know that Solomon is the master of the demons in classical demonology. We have also another story that the sky is protected from the demons. And we have adorned the lowest heaven with lamps, and we have made such lamps as missiles to drive away demons, and have prepared for them the chastisement of a blazing fire. Where does this idea that the sky is protected from demons come from? Well, in a forthcoming paper, Patricia Crone argues for a Zoroastrian origin. I don't know if she's right or not, because I am completely lost with Zoroastrian texts. But maybe here people can give possible answers, so I will be glad to discuss this with you one way or the other. Good question. Why is the sky protected from demons? Well, the reason given in the Qur'an is that the demons should not listen to the high council, to the exalted assembly. That's why the sky is protected from demons. So it's a way to explain that God has lowered the power, the potential power of demons. Well, and this idea that demons should not hear the high council of the exalted assembly can be related to a famous text in the Testament of Solomon. So then I, Solomon, ordered Ornias to be brought to me again, and I asked him, "Tell me how you know that the young man will die in 3 days." He responded, "We demons go up to the firmament of heaven, fly around among the stars, and hear the decisions which issue from God concerning the lives of men. Rest of the time, well, they are doing their work as demons." Well, I don't know how far we can indeed relate these ideas, but at least the Testament of Solomon provides possible explanation to what is at stake in the Qur'an. But note also the very important difference. In the Qur'an, demons are not celestial or astral beings. In the Testament of Solomon, chapter 18, demons reside in stars. Where do the demons reside? It is not clear in the Qur'an. In fact, it is never told. What is clear, at least, is that they can't anymore ascend to heaven. So, now we are coming to the jinns, which is a very complicated topic, and I'm afraid I will be very, very quick about all this, because another lecture would be necessary. I might say, the jinns have many similar points with demons. In a way, this is not unexpected, since the Christian demons and the demonology we find in the Qur'an is clearly close to Christianity. The Christian demons are, in fact, the reinterpretation and diabolization of a category of beings, the spiritual beings, the daimones, whose existence is an accepted and widespread cultural fact. Since the jinns, whatever their origins, indigenous in Arabia or not, that's too big question for me. Since the jinns pertain to a similar category of beings, it is not surprising that they have similar characteristics. But the jinns look like the demons too much, I might say. So they have been also demonized in the Qur'an, even if, of course, what we learn about jinn reveals a much bigger variety of elements. But that's the main point, maybe, of my lecture. We have clearly to separate the jinns as they appear in daily life of Muslims, or even Muslims of ancient times, in the folkloric religion, and what is told about jinns in the Qur'an. I mean, the jinns in the daily life of Muslims, you have a lot of kinds of jinns, of beings, you have many stories, many narratives, many things which are told. In the Qur'an, you have an extremely one-sided representation of the jinns, which tells, in fact, more about the intentions of the Qur'an than about the jinns themselves. So, the jinns, in fact, are quite close to the demons of late antique Jewish demonology, as we could learn about them yesterday. They are geniuses, if you want. They are beings invisible to men. They have a gender. They can be male or female. They can have sex with men or women. They can take many kinds of shapes. They like to haunt the places where men have to go through. They inspire or possess soothsayers and poets as well. The idea that jinns can possess or inspire someone is a topic, indeed, which is important in the Qur'an. It's maybe the most, how could I say, grassroots point of the jinns, which is still in the Qur'an. Otherwise, we mainly have demonization of jinns, as we can see right now. For example, the jinns are answerable to their sins, like the demons, and more generally, like any rational creature. So, jinns who are not believers are doomed to hell, like unbelievers and demons. There is also an ambiguity between the word jinn or jan and snake. For example, we have two verses in the Qur'an where Moses throws the word before Pharaoh, and the word becomes a jan in the Qur'an, not a jinn, but a snake, I think. And we have two parallel verses where we have thorban, namely serpent, snake, as is used in these parallel verses. So it's like the demons, but it's a pure coincidence, I think. I mean, the fact that we have a word for jinn, jan, which can also mean snake, and a word for demon, shaitan, which can also mean snake, I'm not so sure, is deliberate. The unbelievers associate the jinns to God. Men also are wrong in seeking refuge with the jinns. I mean, it is told that men, some people took shelter with jinns, with some jinns, and this was a very bad choice. The idea of jinns or demons or Satan as dangerous sexual assaulters can outcrop sometimes also. For example, the jinns can be involved in sexual assault, see Surah 58, and you have two interesting verses in the Qur'an. In Surah 3, the mother of Mary is telling, just after Mary's birth, I have named her Mary, and I command her and her offspring to your protection, God's protection, from Satan the cursed. I command her to your protection. The same word, indeed in Surah 19 also, same idea about Mary in front of Gabriel. So these two verses, for example, use similar words as the two apotropaic prayers of the end of the Qur'an, Surah 113, 114. In short, we have similarities concerning the jinns as allies, bad advisors, bad teachers, like demons. But we have also similarities which go further. I mean, stories which, like Solomon, I mean, here we have the same story as the one with demons in Surah 21, but here we don't have demons, we have jinns. And even more, here, the jinns also want to ascend to heaven to hear, I suppose, of divine counsel, like the demons. So it means that they are really, in this way, assimilated to demons. In short, demons and jinns are, in many times, used interchangeably. The only exception is in Surah 72 and 46, where we have a story where some jinns believed in monotheism. We have never the same with demons. So there is clearly a demonization of the jinns. This is a remarkable sample of a well-known phenomenon, a phenomenon of acculturation, under the influence or with a new kind of discourse. Popular beliefs are reinterpreted. The existence of jinn is not denied, of course. Anybody, once again, believed in such beings, spirits or geniuses or demons in antiquity. But the jinns get a new interpretation, a new understanding, which in part substitutes itself to a former one, but also in part overlaps with a former one. So the jinns are now the characters of new narratives. They are integrated to a new cosmology and a new worldview. They take place in a new hierarchic order where they are more and more distinguished from the divine. Note that the existence of this kind of demonization and this kind of discourse with such precise intentions should make us very cautious about what the Qur'an says concerning the supposed nature of the jinns. I mean, some people are wondering if jinns are chthonic creatures or aerial creatures, for example. Answering this with the Qur'an, well, we have to remind ourselves that the Qur'an is not here to provide a good and accurate description of jinns. It is here to provide a demonization of the jinns. So it's not a description of the jinns, but the reinterpretation of the jinns. So the Qur'an has an extremely one-sided, monolithic conception of the jinns, and it does not care about precise questions concerning the varieties of spiritual beings considered. I mean, you have something different, for example, if you read probably 8th century text by John of Damascus or Pseudo-Damascus, two brief texts in Greek, which are not translated yet, but my friend Gilles Courtieu has made the translation. They are only edited in the Migne Patrologia about the Dracontes and the Geludes. There, John of Damascus, or Pseudo, I don't know if it's him or not, provides description and refutation, of course, of popular beliefs about dragons and Geludes, is it rule? I don't know. It's complicated because, of course, he makes fun of his beliefs and so on, but he provides many details about popular beliefs, about what these creatures are doing, according to the people he is mentioning, who could be, maybe, I don't know, Arabs. It's not so sure, but it's possible. In the Quran, we don't have this. We have only kind of moral and demonizing discourse. The aim of the Quran, indeed, is to implement a certain number of beliefs and practices about the jinns. And I might say their aim is to assimilate jinns to demons, to associate them with hell, unbelief, and powerlessness, except a few jinns. And once again, all that concerns the popular stories about jinns and so on is simply absent. I don't know how much time left I have.
You could summarize it.
It's not for summarizing, it's for another idea which is not directly related.
We have time until...
Okay, so I would like now to ask some questions. My question is, what are the possible explanations of this kind of discourse in the Quran? Where does this kind of discourse about jinns come from? My quibble is related to, I think, what looks like an aporia in Quranic studies. I mean, there are 4 propositions which are often asserted by some people at least, and these 4 propositions are inconsistent. The first proposition is the idea that there are substantial layers in the Qur'an which display a Christian context and not more than a Jewish one or pagan one. It's quite easy to show. I think it's one of the main points in Western studies, namely, not only do we have in the Qur'an narratives about specific Christian figures, Mary, Jesus, John, but even the stories related to Moses, Abraham, Adam, are as a rule, not always, but most of the time, are closer to Christianity, for example, than to what we find in Jewish sources, as far as we can know, of course. Again, for example, the anti-Jewish topoi that we have in the Quran are directly borrowed from Christian anti-Jewish topoi. And the demonology, as we saw today, seems also much more Christian than anything else, as far as we can know. I do not say that all these layers, another point also, in some cases, clearly, making the profile of the author of such and such Quranic text supposes we have someone with a high knowledge and precise knowledge of Christian stuff. And the question is, where does this knowledge come from? Or where did the author of such and such pericope learn what he knows? And in some cases also we can see clearly that that the text addresses Christian or displays interactions with Christians. So I don't say that all the Christian layers of the Quran should be explained the same way, but I just notice that we have substantial layers in the Quran which display one way or the other a Christian background or context. That's the first point. The second point, the second proposition, is that the Quran is supposed to mirror Muhammad's preaching. Just to be clear right now, I think we should completely give up this idea. But anyway, this is a well-known idea. The third proposition is that Muhammad's career took place in Western Arabia, Mecca and Medina. And the fourth proposition is that, as far as we can know, the Christian presence in Western Arabia was, at best, marginal. Well, it is clear that these four propositions, as they stand here, this way, are not consistent. It is simply insane to keep all these four propositions together. So you have to give up at least one of them. Okay?
Can you repeat the third one?
Third one, Muhammad's career took place in Western Arabia.
And how does this...
And the fourth one is Western Arabia had a limited, at best, Christian presence.
The second and third, they are...
Not the same, because, for example, you might say, I don't say this, but some people might say, okay, the Quran mirrors Muhammad's preaching, but his preaching took place, for example, in Palestine or Syria. That's another thing. I just try to be logical. I mean, to give a sketch of possible options, to see what we should do. And the question, of course, is, what should we give up among these four propositions?
Your chronology that you mentioned earlier is based on none of these?
It's a relative chronology based purely and only on the analysis of texts. It's purely, I mean, it's the relative chronology I gave up earlier, so I think you are... it's based purely on examining the various texts and the way they were composed. For example, I just give an example briefly for Surah 2. You can clearly notice in Surah 2 a redundancy between two in the narrative, which should be explained by the fact that the author of Surah 2 uses both the different versions in Surah 7 and 20, and that's why, and that's the best explanation to tell that Surah 2 is later. So you can discuss the chronology. For example, 7 before 20 is more speculative than the other points. But that, for example, 38 is the first one, is extremely plausible, and so on. Okay? So it's based purely, it's a relative chronology. It's based purely on the analysis of the texts themselves according to the methods of reduction criticism. But, for example, I'm pretty sure that Surah 2 this way is far later than Medina. But that's another point. No. But it's another, I mean, it's...
When you say that the author of the Quran uses...
authors. I think it's a collective work indeed, yeah.
20 explanations?
Well,
because it's very tricky.
yeah, no, it's, well,
because we don't see now this.
I know, that's not my point, I mean, in this lecture, but I think we can clearly explain it when you are comparing the text and trying to find the best explanation. It's a usual question of finding a good chronology, but even if it's, of course, sometimes tentative, in this precise case, that Surah 2 is the latest one, is particularly clear, because there is a problem in Surah 2, in the narrative. I mean, and in this kind, the best explanation is that the author uses the text themselves and decided to mix both narratives. It can be explained, but it would need a whole lecture. But just trust me, if you want to have more information, I can send you some stuff about it. So, in some cases, I think, indeed, a composition after the conquest is more plausible. What I want to highlight here about this text, about demonology, so what does this kind of discourse look like? Well, is it a prophet who gained knowledge on such topics, for example, through informants or oral narratives, and decided to reform a pagan community, or someone living in a community? That's the first idea. For example, suppose that, let's say, Muhammad gained information with his travels while meeting people and decided to preach this kind of demonology to make the Meccans, for example, give up their idolatrous beliefs. I'm not so sure that's extremely convincing, because what is striking is that I'm not so sure he could explain the very specific and one-sided idea we have about demons. Second, is it someone living in a community with various religious communities, Christian, Jewish, pagan, who decided to reform and convert the pagan part of his community? Now, since this demonology is mainly Christian, it might make you suppose that there were a group of Christians, for example, in Mecca. Well, I won't discuss this, but we need evidence of this, and we don't have. Far from that. Or, just an hypothesis. Do we have here the traces of the activities of Christian missionaries who address pagans with the usual topoi of missionaries? And in this case, the texts, as we have them, would be the results of such interactions between the missionaries and the community or the communities who received the mission. There is nothing apologetic here. It's not my point. Just to try to explain in the best possible way how this kind of stuff could have been born. I mean, if you read the text about missionaries everywhere, because they have generally in all times similar kinds of strategies, it's quite close. So it looks like this, in part at least. So this process can lead to a subversion of missionary ideas also. And we have this kind of subversion in the Qur'an. Take, for example, Surah 72, which I can't discuss here. In Surah 72, we have a group of jinns who are believers. So, in this case, we have a de-demonization of jinns, and the jinns who are believers are clearly claiming, asserting a discourse which is, in Surah 72, I think not only anti-polytheistic, but anti-Trinitarian. So in this case, we might have a kind of subversion. So these are, of course, hypotheses, but one question we should have in mind every time when we read the Qur'an is, whose texts are these? Whom these texts belong to? I mean, it's not so clear, you know? We read them as belonging to a Meccan and Medinan community. Maybe what we have are reappropriation in some times of earlier texts who could have other origins and non-autochthonous, for example, origins. Once again, these are hypotheses or rough ideas that I want to think about in the next future. Last example in Surah 71, just to give an example in a different field. We have a Noah story in Surah 71. And this Noah story is adapted to an Arab audience. For example, I quote, Noah has said, O my Lord, they have disobeyed me, but they follow men whose wealth and children give them no increase, but only loss. And they have devised a tremendous plot. And they have said to each other, abandon not your gods, abandon neither Wad, nor Suwa, neither Yaguth, nor Yauq, nor Nasr. That's interesting. Does it look, it might look like a missionary teaching the Noah stories to pagans and adapting his discourse to this kind of people. And maybe we have a similar thing with the demonology of the Qur'an. Once again, these are conjectures or sketches, but I think they are worth thinking about them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. I open the floor for comments, questions, remarks. Domenico, please.
Thank you, Guillaume. I have just, there is this image of demons flying around the stars. I thought immediately we have something similar in Zoroastrianism, Paragon, witches flying around the stars and fighting against the stars. They are fighting with Ormazd, the planets with Ahriman. But it was just, I wanted just to stress this image. Can you say more about this?
Well, not so about Zoroastrianism, less than you.
Not Zoroastrianism, but how this image can enter actually
in the Quran. Well, if this idea has Zoroastrian origins, and it's perfectly possible. I mean, oh, sorry. If this idea has Zoroastrian, Iranian, let's say, origins, well, it's perfectly possible. Well, given the nature of the evidence, we have to speculate a bit because we have no text, and even the Iranian texts are later than the Quran, but we guess the traditions are earlier, but the texts themselves are later. Well, the explanation, a possible explanation which comes to my mind at first is that, first of all, such ideas can navigate between confessions and communities very easily. That's the first point. We should not put strict confessional barriers between the communities as the religious entrepreneurs will do it. But I would be tempted to think about a Christian from the Sasanian world, like Nestorian missionaries, who could be familiar with such ideas. The idea of Nestorian missionaries in Arabia, not the Hijaz necessarily, but in Arabia, is quite plausible and tested. And I even think there are some arguments which could also go in this way. For example, I think that it's very possible that in the Quran you have various Christologies, in fact, but you have a low Christology sometimes, and I wonder if the low Christology of the Quran could not be explained as a kind of misinterpretation or partial rejection, partial acceptance of Nestorian Christology. I have a text, for example, which I can read you, not to answer your question directly, but to say how such things can happen. This text is, if I have to find it, I'm sorry, because okay. In the Acts of Aretas, for example, in the Greek text, well, it's a mid-6th century Greek source which describes the martyrdoms that occurred in Najran under the Jewish king Thunues. One passage describes a theological debate at Al-Hira, which is the following. It describes how Thunues' envoy comes to Mundir seeking the death of the Christians. At this point, an envoy from the Nestorian Catholicos, called Shila, arrives, and he urges the Orthodox at the court of Hira to accept the position that Jesus was a perfect man and not a god. I quote, "We are Persians, and we know that the king of the Romans and his priest know that the Jews crucified a man and not a god." Well, so it's quite easy to misinterpret this kind of discourse, or just to accept a part and deny a part. That might be the kind of interactions which could explain how such ideas, like Christology or about the demons and so on, could enter the Quranic world. I think it's much more plausible than the ideas which support, for example, Jewish Christians somewhere in Arabia, because I'm not ready to imagine pre-Islamic Arabia as a kind of Jurassic Park for ancient heresies. So that's the way I would look at things. But the big problem is we lack sources, of course. So I try to work with what we have in a plausible way, that's all. But I don't like to speculate too much. But when you have some... I mean, the analysis of the text we have, namely the Qur'an, shows that the kind of text we have is extremely significant. I mean, the one-sidedness of this text is extremely significant about the ideas behind such text. That's all what I try to say, and I also try to show what happened to the jinns in the Qur'an, because in fact, the way most of the Muslims believe about jinns, they believe in jinns, for example, because it's supposed to be a dogma, it's in the Qur'an, but the content of their beliefs in jinn is extremely, or almost no Quranic at all. It comes from other sources.
Thank you. We have another question from Kelly.
A follow-up. So as Nico was mentioning the stars and this idea of the stars somehow guarding against the demons, it made me think also of the tradition where you have in early Judaism the notion in some text of stars as sentient beings. And in some of the Enochic literature, for example, and there, I think there's a certain group of scholars these days who see some sort of an exchange between these heavenly bodies and angelic figures. And so I'm wondering if it might not be possible that this image of the stars as blocking or as guarding the demons, it might not derive from that sort of tradition. And in terms of thinking along the lines of transmission, in a number of these texts, like these Enochic texts and Jubilees, they're known, of course, to Pseudo-Clementine homilies, as you mentioned. And so anyways, I'm thinking it's, it could be an interesting angle. Of course, it could be far more complicated with Platonism and
Greco-Roman literature is a very important topic for us. The big problem we have also with Enochian literature and traditions is that well, we know they've been assimilated in Ethiopian Christianity, for example, but we have much more knowledge about them until the 3rd or 4th century than after. That's once again the problem. Maybe things could be clearer later, but I know there is a book in preparation by John Reeves and Annette Reed about these traditions in late antiquity, so I'm waiting for this book to tell more. But yeah, it's also a point to take into consideration.
Yeah,
Matthew, please.
Just a couple of points. First of all, regarding Shaitan al-Rajim, I think it's worth looking at the article published by Silverstein in the Journal of the American Oriental Society, in which he said something that, remarkably independently, James Ford and I had come to a very similar conclusion. He published a very nice article on it, that Rajim here means the accuser, and it comes more from the Akkadian Ragam, which is to bring a legal case against, in which case this is the classic role of the shaitan as being the opposer. The other general point I wanted to make was regarding the literature from late antiquity, and here I'm going to put my Mandean hat on, of course, because we all see these texts as from the perspective from which we come. What I learned from the Mandean texts very cautiously is that when you have a body like this sort of slightly outlying, non-mainstream, minority body of literature, you suddenly discover what people are thinking and reading that is very much not in line with the main lines of Jewish or Christian thought. And so I'm quite, I don't want to say skeptical, but I'm cautious about taking classical Jewish or Christian texts and saying, well, let's compare those to what's going on in these outlying regions, because there's a lot. I mean, I gave a lecture in Tel Aviv on the Jesus story in Mandean literature, and it's very far from the Jesus story in Christianity.
Yes.
It's got bits of it, but you know, the entire chronology is way out, and many differences. So I think when you're looking at the characters and you're saying, well, did this come from Christianity or from Judaism? It may have come through from those, but through the medium of a popular religion in Arabia, which has not survived because we have no traces.
Of course, it's always a possibility. I'm not at all dismissing popular religions and so on. And by the way, I often try to look for sources in less scribal text. For example, for the Christian stuff in the Qur'an or the Mary stuff, you have to go to lectionaries and liturgical and popular traditions. Thanks to, well, we are lucky enough to have more traces about Mary than about some other topics. So I perfectly agree that these ideas, and that's why I speak of missionaries, by the way, because missionaries are very grassroots. Now, about Mandeans, I don't know them enough to be sure if there is something behind. What I just tried to compare was in rough outlines. Well, the demons, as we can find, I mean, the Iblis story, the Shaitan and the demons, as we find in the Qur'an, as far as I know, what they look like most is mainstream Christian demonology. Well, after, you can have to be cautious, of course, but that's what it looks like. Sometimes you can have, indeed, more popular ideas or things which have been changed, but one thing which is becoming more acute now in Quranic studies, but we have to be cautious also, is that in the past, in many cases, whenever people met a Quranic story about, I don't know, Mary or Moses or Abraham and so on, and found it very strange compared, for example, to the Bible, they just said, okay, it's Muhammad who had bad informants or did not understand and changed it. Well, now the problem we have, now we find that in many cases the Quran is referring roughly to narratives which are attested in the living traditions of late antiquity, in particular with Syriac community tradition, but not only. I think it's a more promising view, but we have to be cautious indeed, and my colleagues sometimes are too focused on books and scribes. So they ask bad questions. I just give an example, which has nothing to do with this topic, but which is quite revealing. If you read, for example, the story of the sleepers of the cave in Surah 18, there is a dog in the Quran. If you read the earliest narratives, as we have them about this story in Christian text, namely two homilies by Jacob of Sarug, you don't find the dog, you find a watcher, an angel. So, one famous colleague said, well, how is it possible that the angel of Christian story became a dog? It's very strange. But the question is bad. In fact, thanks to a book about pilgrimage, we know that the story, as it was told in popular circles, had a dog. So, in fact, it's not the Qur'an who added a dog. The Qur'an kept the dog, and Jacob of Sarug removed the dog, because, of course, keeping the dog was a problem with this idea of a resurrection of flesh. So the Qur'an is closer, in general, to popular traditions. But we have also a scribal work at work sometimes. And here, it seems to me that we do not have, for example, the virtuoso scribe of Surah 19 or 3, that we have, I think, for reasons I could show later. But we have someone who is quite knowledgeable. It's not, I think, only oral narratives. It's only some, I mean, this is a set of text where people have a clear project in mind. And this clear project reminds me, I mean, it's maybe not enough, but reminds me of missionary discourse, and intentions. Maybe it's something else, but it reminds me of this. And if, for example, you read the literature about missionaries and interactions between missionaries and, for example, in Africa, well, the similarities are striking. It's not enough to get the point, but the similarities are really striking. You just have to read the anthropological literature on this topic. It's really surprising.
We have Danielle and Kelly again.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood correctly your hypothesis about the missionaries. So if the author of the Quran, Muhammad, and his entourage were missionaries, apparently Christian missionaries, because a kind of Christian missionaries preaching for a pagan community.
That's not what I say.
Eh?
That's not what I say.
Ah, then I not the
if I could put the point in another way, the Quran is full of Christian stuff, to my mind, one way or the other. But I don't think that Muhammad's community was Christian. I don't think that Muhammad's community was Christian. So, of course, the conclusion is that maybe we should separate more than we do Muhammad's community and the Quran, one way or the other. Because one possible explanation would be, okay, Muhammad and his community were kinds of Christian, maybe Orthodox, I don't know what, and the Christian stuff comes from this community. It's very hard for me to believe, at least if we situate Muhammad's career in Western Arabia, that he was a Christian of any kind.
But what was he then, if he was not?
I mean, I think we were clearly in a situation of acculturation. I have no answer. I mean, my point here is simply to dismiss a possible answer, because I don't think we have enough evidence yet. But I know we have some colleagues who see Mecca, for example, as a place full of Christians. I don't at all, but I know we have people. Now, it's not impossible that the text, as we have them, could reflect interactions between missionary Christians and people who were subjected to this activity and appropriated it one way or the other. That's all what I say. That's possible. That's at least it could look like this. But I don't assert that Muhammad was a kind of Christian. My main problem with this, my two problems with this idea of a Mecca full of Christians is the lack of evidence on many kinds. And also, what is basic, I mean, with the Christian community is the cult. All that we can guess about the cult of the conquerors does not look Christian at all. I mean, we have some ideas about their temples and so on, but we have no example. So I think it's extremely risky to overestimate the Christian presence in the Hijaz, or at least we can't take it for granted. I have colleagues, for example, who say, okay, since the Quran is full of Christian stuff, it means Mecca was full of Christian. No, it's secular. Okay, that's what I just want to say. After, I have to think more deeply about all these topics, but I just wanted to highlight similarities between the kind of discourse we have here and what we can expect from missionaries. And because, well, we know Arabia was a ground for missionaries, but Western Arabia is different, once again. I mean, south of Aqaba, we have no evidence of Christian presence, no material evidence. They had no bishops. I mean, we have the councils, for example, of the late 6th century and so on. We know where there were bishops. There were none there. We know where, at least, there were holy men, holy Christian men. We have no testimony about it. I don't say the absence of evidence is evidence of absence, but at least this is absence of evidence.
Thank you. And last remark, Kelly.
Is there time?
Very shortly, because
I can share with you my question, and then perhaps we can talk about it during the break or at another point. But I was curious to think, since you pushed us and encouraged us to move beyond text, what can we find by way of material culture that speaks to traditions or popular thinking around jinn and demons? This was my question.
Oh, well, we have... in the Islamic world, representation about demons, I mean, we have no iconography. The Quran, by the way, gives no description at all, so it's purely moral discourse. About jinns, we might guess about some bowls, but in early Islamic literature, but later we have things like amulets, for example, and it's very used, amulets against jinns. But for my period, I don't know of material culture which could help us. Maybe I am wrong, but for my period, I don't know of anything which could help us on this precise topic.
Thank you very much for a very interesting session.